7.
Oh gosh, I don't
So then you can't do 4, 5 or 7, then you have to go 6, 8, 9 and 10.
We've come out through to the Shongweni market today. It's a good opportunity for me to test this lens and see what it can do. I'm going to test the autofocus feature, is going to test that depth of field at 2.8. Let's see how it does. So it's absolutely massive. I thought I'd walk through all of it, and it just seems to go on and on and on. The selection of food is just out of this world. I've got this. And this also. And there'll be more. So it's the next day and we're back from the market, and I'm actually really happy with the way that the lens was performing. I got to shoot a couple of videos, got to shoot a few stills on it. I haven't put it on the computer yet, but just looking at the screen in the back, the LCD on the camera, I can give you a few remarks on what I've seen. Number one, the autofocus on the camera is really good. There were times when I was shooting video that I wasn't sure whether it was pulling focus accurately. So in a pinch, the autofocus can come in handy, but for the most part, if shooting video, my personal feel is to shoot manual focus and you get to decide what's in focus. Don't let your gear choose how it's going to represent your subject. You choose how you represent your subject. With the photos, I did a couple of more tests this morning, looking at some of the pictures that I took yesterday, as well as the ones from this morning, shooting at f2.8, that depth of field is really nice. You're getting a really smooth bokeh in the background, so you've got a nice separation between your subject and the background, which I'm really pleased about. That separation is a bit less noticeable when you're shooting at 14, but when you're zooming the lens into 24, it really does look good. What's great about this camera is the option to go into APS-C mode, so you're getting a crop factor on your camera. So I can take this 24 lens and shoot at probably around 38. When you're shooting at that focal length, the separation between your background and your subject looks fantastic. The background has a lot of bokeh in it, which is a very appealing factor, and people really like that. And in my personal opinion, it looks really good as well. The autofocus is great. It's picking up on the eye really nice and quickly. I will do a comparison and look between a native Sony lens and the Sigma lens we have here and see how this lens holds up to a native lens. So as you can see, obviously in these photos, there's a difference in the compression, shooting at 14 and then at 24 and then hitting APS-C mode, cropping in a little bit more and shooting at that 38 focal length. And at 14, the image is kind of distorted, and unless you're going for that particular look, I wouldn't recommend doing any portraits at this focal length. And then as you're cropping in and getting closer, 24, that 38, it starts becoming more natural looking. So that's something to consider with this lens. Based off of that, I wouldn't really use it as a lens for portraiture. Like I said, the primary uses for it are going to be architecture, landscapes, but it does still look really good. I think shooting at 24 and 35, we've got that nice depth of field on it. The image is really crisp and sharp. It's focusing really nice and quickly. So it is something you could use for portraits. I wouldn't go and do corporate headshots on it, but it definitely does lend itself well to play in that arena from a creative perspective. All right, let's get into the autofocus comparison test. I took the native Sony lens at 24-105 and I compared it to the Sigma. I shot both at a focal length of 24 at f4.0. Reason being, the Sony's aperture only comes down to f4. So I thought to do a fair comparison, I would put the Sigma at f4 as well and see how they compared. So as you guys can probably see by now, Sigma holds up really well. I don't see any difference in terms of the Sigma's autofocus capabilities compared to the native Sony's autofocus capabilities. Now let's have a look if there's any distortion on the edges of the image when you're shooting ultra wide at that 14mm focal length. There is very slight curvature on the edges of the frame. Now for video, this will be slightly more difficult to repair. However, there are plugins that you can utilize in order to negate this effect. As far as photos go, Lightroom really does the trick in order to restore your images to a more natural look and feel if you need to shoot at that 14mm focal length. Now we've seen a couple of portrait shots and how the lens holds up in that arena. However, it isn't purpose built for portraits. Let me show you a couple of architectural shots so you can see this lens functioning in the arena it was built for. There is a slight vignetting on the edges of the image. That, however, Lightroom takes care of pretty easily. In Lightroom, if you go to the Lens Corrections tab, under there you'll select Enable Profile Corrections, and then Lens Make. You'll scroll down, hit Sigma, and it'll automatically detect this lens for you and apply the corrections. For these architectural shots, I did shoot at a focal length of f5.0. This is important when shooting real estate or architecture so that you get more of the image in focus. I also held the camera in one position and shot the same scene at different focal lengths to give you the opportunity to see whether or not there was any distortion on the edges and what the image looked like at different focal lengths. Now, when it came to filters for this lens, that was a bit of a tricky one. Sigma has developed a rear filter holder for this lens because the glass on the front is pretty bulbous, and so you're not going to be able to just slap a filter right on the front. Now, I wasn't able to get my hands on one of these filters, so I can't give you information as to how they hold up. However, I will put a link in the description below so that you can visit the Sigma site and make a call on your own as to whether this is something that you would like to utilize. Your other option here is a filter holder kit. So on the front of the lens, you can attach a filter holder kit, and you can use filters on the front of the lens there. The filter holder kit is going to cost you a little bit more. The rear filter holder, I think, will be a little bit more fiddly. So there are pros and cons to both. Now, the whole reason for buying this lens was to add a wide angle zoom lens to my existing kit. This wasn't the only lens I looked at. I looked at this, I looked at the Tamron 18-28 f2.8, and then I looked at your native Sony 16-35s. The f4 variation and the f2.8 variation. For me personally, this lens made more sense. In my kit, I already have a 24-105. So if I had bought the 16-35 from the Sony, or if I had bought the 18-28 in the Tamron, I would have had an overlap because I only needed a lens that went up to 24. So from that perspective, this made a lot more sense to me in terms of not having an overlapping focal length. Personally, I would have felt like that was a bit of a waste, and I'm happy to swap my lenses out if needing to boost to that extended focal length of 24-105. On the A7 III, I'm also lucky that I have that crop APS-C mode, so I hit a button and all of a sudden my 24 shoots all the way up to a 38. For that reason, I already encompass that 16-35 focal length that I would have had in the Sony lenses. Now, seeing how this lens holds up to the Sony lenses in terms of their autofocus capabilities, I am really pleased that I made this decision. That was one factor that made me lean a little bit more towards the Sony end of the spectrum. However, that clearly isn't a factor anymore, as Sigma have done a fantastic job with their autofocus in this lens. Now, the Tamron does look like a terrific lens, and it was really high up on my list of consideration. From a price point perspective, the Sigma and the Tamron made more sense to me as they shot at f2.8 as opposed to the Sony 16-35. If I wanted the 2.8 variation of that lens, the price jumps significantly. So it really came down to the Tamron and the Sigma for me. So what made me sway towards the Sigma? Well, that extra 4mm of focal length at the low end of the range. When it comes to shooting architecture and real estate, any little bit of extra wide angle that you get, you want to utilize. And from that perspective, this lens made more sense over the Tamron. I've had this lens for around a week now, and I've had an opportunity to play with it and get a feel for what it's capable of. If there's anything you feel that I've missed out on, or you might want me to address in a later video, please comment below and let me know your thoughts. If you found this review helpful, give me a subscribe and a like on this video. That would be much appreciated. Share it with your friends if you think they're going to enjoy the content as well. And we'll see you in the next one.